We began this course trying to think more deeply about democracy, shifting then to the role of journalism in a democracy, asking that question, what are journalists for? Stepping back and thinking at the macro level, the institutional level. What role does journalism? John Pilger is now in his 60s. He's been a journalist, started out, remember, he spoke about his beginnings as a kind of an apprentice in a very standard mainstream newspaper. He's covered the entire globe. He's worked in newspaper, magazine, books, documentary films. He's got a wealth of experience, and he's not only been covering the world, but of course observing journalism. So what I want to do is play you a couple of clips of Pilger reflecting on the journalism that he sees, and not surprisingly, you're going to hear him be critical. Then I want to come back, offer some other ways to think about it before we pick up on some examples of Pilger's journalism. So here's a clip of Pilger speaking in the US a couple of years ago when the book you're reading, Freedom Next Time, first came out, and he's reflecting on that mainstream journalism.
Well, the title of this talk is Freedom Next Time, which of course is the title of the book, and the book is meant as an antidote to the propaganda that's so often disguised as journalism. And so I thought I would talk today about journalism, about war by journalism, propaganda and silence, and how that silence might be broken. Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations, wrote about an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. He was referring to journalism, the media. That was almost 80 years ago, not long after corporate journalism was invented. It's a history few journalists talk about or know about, and it began with the arrival of corporate advertising. As the new corporations began taking over the press, something called professional journalism was invented. To attract big advertisers, the new corporate press had to appear respectable, pillars of the establishment, objective, impartial, balanced. The first schools of journalism were set up, and a mythology of liberal neutrality was spun around the professional journalist. The right to freedom of expression was associated with the new media and with the great corporations, and the whole thing was, as Robert McChesney put it so well, entirely bogus. For what the public didn't know was that in order to be professional, journalists had to ensure that news and opinion were dominated by official sources, and that hasn't changed. Go through the New York Times on any day and check the sources of the main political stories, domestic and foreign. You'll find they're dominated by governments and other establishment interests. That's the essence of professional journalism. I'm not suggesting that independent journalism was or is excluded, but it's more likely to be an honorable exception.
Pilger is making reference to critiques we've read in Bennett's book and heard in class, that one of the things that limits this so-called objective journalism is its dependence on official sources. But the reason I wanted to play that clip is he's using the term professional journalist in a negative sense. And we want to make clear why he's doing that. Most of you, if you're majoring in journalism, it's because you want to become a professional, yes? You want to be. You come to college to learn how to be a professional journalist. So we have to think a bit about what this term professional means. If professional means educated, self-reflective, schooled in law, ethics, history, all the things that deepen our understanding of the world, learning to improve your ability to gather information, process information, present information. If that's what professional means, that's a good thing. Right? Deepening your sense of the world and your ability to communicate. So professional can have a positive connotation. right? Improving your knowledge, improving your skills. Pilger here is using professional in a different way. The concept of professionalizing an occupation, not necessarily to improve it, but to control it. This concept of professionalization has multiple meanings. It can be used in a positive sense, but it also can be used with a critical edge. That professionalizing the practice of journalism makes it easier for people in power to control, because then those people who are identified as journalists in the culture have been properly socialized. They've gone through a school of journalism and learned certain values about, as he's suggesting, objectivity. But if those values and practices around objectivity should be critiqued, as we've suggested, then being socialized into them, being professionalized, is not necessarily a good thing. This is an important thought for any of you who are going to go into the School of Journalism and major in that subject here. Because as you leave this class and go into the other courses, you're going to find that everyone in the School of Journalism doesn't approach these matters like I do. In fact, you may find that very few people approach these things as I do. In fact, you may find that I'm a bit of an outlier. In fact, you may find that I'm a bit of a freak. You can describe it any way you like. But this class is a critical introduction. It doesn't mean the entire School of Journalism is going to reflect that critique. Much of the instruction in the School of Journalism, not only here at the University of Texas, but in virtually every School of Journalism, is going to be essentially instruction socializing you into the objectivity norms that we're critiquing. I want to make this very clear, because sometimes students take my class and then they're confused when they get in other classes. We're stepping back, looking at the role of journalism, recognizing the value of journalism, in fact, the crucial value of journalism in a democratic society, but then we're critiquing the norms, the routines, the professional practices of journalists today. In other areas in the School of Journalism, you're not going to be critiquing those practices, you're going to be schooled in them. And part of the reason I teach this course the way I do is to give you the tools to critique as you go through the rest of the program. There are differences of opinion about the value of those professional practices. Pilger is expressing a critique of them. Other folks in the School of Journalism will express support for them. So you're going to have to sort that out as you move through the program. But Pilger does critique them. He's saying essentially that professionalizing journalism has contained journalism. It's taken the radical spirit, the intrinsic, what he would call the intrinsic value of journalism as truly oppositional to power, and it's bringing it kind of into the fold. So what Pilger says very quickly here has a long history behind it, and it's going to be, for some of you as you move through the School of Journalism, an extremely important thing to keep in mind. Questions about that, this concept of professionalizing? Is there anything about it that doesn't quite make sense? All right. Let's go to another clip. This is Pilger speaking a bit earlier in 1996, and he's going to, in this particular clip, talk a bit more about the concept of propaganda. You heard him use the term propaganda in that first clip, and usually we associate propaganda with totalitarian societies, with dictatorships, yes? The classic propaganda system was that of the old Soviet Union, where all of the newspapers, all of the broadcast outlets were state-controlled, and therefore a vehicle for state propaganda. All the media, all the traditional media in the Soviet Union reflected the point of view of those in power. That's what we tend to think of as propaganda. Before that, probably the classic, we study the propaganda of Nazi Germany, in which all of this media was meant to control people, channel people's thoughts. What does it mean to talk about propaganda in a free society? United States, Great Britain, Australia, the places that Pilger has lived and worked are free societies with pretty extensive guarantees of freedom of expression. So what does the term propaganda mean in that context? He's going to talk about that here. Well, the secret, of course, is that propaganda... Let's reflect on some of the things Pilger is saying. He's referring to a conversation he had with a Russian who came to the U.S. after living in the Soviet system where propaganda produced a uniform media, and the Russian says, it's quite striking that even though you have a free press, your press looks a lot like the press in Russia, kind of a uniformity. Now, does that mean that the American media, news media, in our system, relatively free and open, truly is nothing more than the propaganda arm of the government? Is that what it means? Well, no, of course not, because one can read critique, one can read stories in the American media that the government doesn't want published. There is conflict between government and media. But the observer was making a larger point that even with that freedom, there is a certain kind of ideological uniformity to American news media. And that's the kind of use of the term propaganda Pilger is talking about. Not propaganda systems in the sense of centralized control from an authoritarian government, but a propaganda system that's shaped by the professional journalism we've been talking about. Not exactly the same system, not the same outcome, but some similarities that we would be perhaps advised to think about. He talks about how we describe this as an information society, and he says he doesn't think it's an information society, it's a media society. It may not be clear what he means by that. I take that to mean that information implies that people are out gathering information, coming to judgment, that there's an open process in which ordinary people are engaged. And he's suggesting, no, it's more of a media society, media-driven. The media constructs the world for us. The media does not simply provide information to us that we then take and use for our purposes, but the news media construct a world that constrains us as well. Again, this isn't some suggestion that we live in some totalitarian society where a small number of people who run the news media collaborate with a small number of people who run the government and somehow nefariously make this whole system work to keep you in the dark. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a free, open, he uses the term a liberal system. In that sense, he doesn't mean liberal in the sense of liberal versus conservative in everyday politics. He means the term liberal in the broader Enlightenment sense, an open system, a liberal system. Okay. In the same sense that the University of Texas is a liberal institution, not because of its particular politics on contemporary issues, but because its commitment to an open educational system. All right. So Pilger, again, stepping back and critiquing, applying that critique in a specific sense to the way mainstream news media cover the economic system, or in this example he uses, really don't cover the fundamental inequality in the system, right? Therefore leaving people unaware of the nature of that inequality. Right? Those are the points Pilger's trying to make, that the system that has allowed him to do his work, he lives in this free and open and liberal society. And it has allowed him, as he says at the end of that first clip, to pursue a kind of independent journalism. Right? So he's not suggesting that somehow he's been censored, he's been squashed by this. He's saying it's the overall design of the system and the patterns that we see play out in the media that are problematic. Okay? So that's a critique of the dominant mainstream media from Pilger. Any